Hello and welcome to Something About the Beatles, episode number 235. So for the years that this show has been around, I've been wanting to do something with the Beach Boys and the Beatles and their creative rivalry. And suddenly it all came into focus this year when you had two 80th birthdays back to back with Sir Paul and then Brian Wilson this month. And it so happened that I had a recurring guest who was really eager to take on this subject, Glenn Greenberg, and there was others I've talked to that we were talking about maybe doing a Beach Boys show. But this is really more focused on Brian Wilson and Paul and their relationship rather than the more general Beach Boys and Beatles creative rivalry, although there is a bit of that as well. But in any event, the door is still open to doing further Beach Boys discussions if warranted. But this was a really good one to have because I think that it is a good thing to honor Brian as a creative, gifted individual. There's a lot of parallels there with Paul, both being their respective bass players in their bands, for starters, as well as multi-instrumentalists and composers, and guys that, well, through their 70s, were still on the road and still creating. And there's definitely contrasts to be made as well, which we do in the course of this show. Glenn Greenberg had come on originally for the Dear Friend show, examining the friendship between John and Paul, such as it was in the 1970s, and then we did a show on hypothetical Beatle releases as a group after 1970, both of which he is well versed to discuss. But Beach Boys is another passion of his, and as I noted in the last show, his newsstand special published by Time magazine, Paul McCartney at 80, is out. Check it out. It's a great sort of, I was going to call it a Reader's Digest, but that's kind of funny, actually, for a Time publication to call it that. But it is a great read, lavishly illustrated, worth your time if you just want to have a relatively quick read compared to a full-length book covering the highlights of this man's career before, during, and after the Beatles. It is absolutely worth your time. Or as a gateway to people who might not be as deep and hardcore of Beatle fans, it's definitely worth your checking out. But this was the discussion we wanted to have, and it made sense with the two 80th birthdays coming boom boom. And so we do compare and contrast their careers, and there's a lot of ground to cover. And we hope at least we did them both justice in this first conversation on the topic of Beach Boys on Something About the Beatles. I don't like to make these intros too long, so I'll try to keep this one brief, just to toss a couple other things out there. This is being posted on the heels of Paul's appearance at Glastonbury, which was a phenomenal thing. Obviously, I wasn't there, but I have watched some of the video and seen the write-ups about it. I'm wondering if anybody who's a regular listener to the show was there. I'm sure there are plenty of you that watched it on BBC in Britain, the delayed broadcast, minus In Spite of All the Danger. But if you were there and you feel like discussing it, especially if you had any special experiences, do reach out, because I have now started officially the series of YouTube videos of getting fan stories, documenting stuff and getting it out there. The first one was recorded this week. It should be out in another week or so. It's actually a Paul tour story taking place in the States in the last month, safe to say. Anybody who's got any personal encounters or first-hand witness experiences with the Beatles, with the ex-Beatles, anything like that, anything cool like that you guys want to share, come to me. We'll record something and throw it up on YouTube, because I think it's a cool thing just to be able to collect these things and present them to other listeners and fans of the show. I'm going to mention a couple things. BetterHelp and Gravity to Fire. Remember those terms, because you may be hearing more of them. And I've got some great shows in the can, more on the horizon, more things to look forward to. But for now, let's get the discussion of Brian Wilson at 80 underway with my guest, Glenn Greenberg. Multi-instrumentalist like Paul, master of anything you throw at him, does a lot of composing on piano, of course. And him and Paul, this sort of musical kinship that they had. Now, there's a lot to talk about. They did have personal interactions, of course, over time. But before that, I'm wondering personally, when the Beatles first came to America, and the Beach Boys had a few hits under their belts, starting in 62 with Surfin', right? And I'm not sure how big that was nationally, but certainly early 64 was Fun they had in the charts, and Don't Worry Baby.
Warmth of the Sun.
Yeah, they are established. 63, they had all the Hot Rod stuff. So I wonder when Paul personally became aware of them and actually was listening to their records. Do we have any record of him being into the hot rod stuff or surfing?
Not that I've seen in terms of anything Paul has said. Obviously, they were aware of the Beach Boys, but I don't know the precise moment where Paul really just sort of glommed onto that sound and became a fan of it. The earliest mention that I think he ever made specifically about the Beach Boys was Pet Sounds.
Right. And we do have that great Lennon quote from, I guess, around the time of Rubber Soul, where he's commenting on The Little Girl I Once Knew.
Yes. He thought it was great.
Yeah. And his take on that song, not to talk about the song so much as to make the point, Brian is not on the road anymore. Look what he can do just sitting back, letting these musical ideas come to fruition in the studio in LA because he's not wasting his time touring. That's sort of the implicit subtext is, what are we doing on the road? We could be doing that kind of stuff. So yeah. It's a great observation, and coming from the person I would least think would be into that. But apparently Beach Boys and surf music was a big enough deal in Britain that you've got Keith Moon famously being a fan of that stuff before he's in The Who.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you beat me to the punch. I was going to say, hey, Keith Moon.
Right. Who records Don't Worry Baby one day.
Exactly. And of course, to sort of keeping engaged during the Who Are You sessions, they did Barbara Ann.
That's right.
So, yeah, I mean, he was a big, in fact, Keith Moon wasn't that big a fan of Pet Sounds. He felt it was a betrayal.
Right. So yeah, there's a great quote from him. I'm trying to remember what he said. I don't think he used the word boring or something like that, but it means nothing. Something like that. Betrayal. Like, I've been with you to this point, Brian, and now you've lost me.
Exactly. Yeah. But if John was into The Little Girl I Once Knew, I think we can assume Paul liked it too.
Sure. And I'm just wondering, just having shared the U.S. label, I'm assuming because we got the great quote from Brian about the U.S. version of Rubber Soul, as I point out, that he had to, as a veteran Capitol recording artist by late 1965, he's getting a feed of new product from them. He had to be acutely aware of when Capitol decided to put all that money at the end of 63 into launching I Want to Hold Your Hand and the Beatles at long last. Maybe in his own head wondering if that was going to be a threat to them, wondering if that's going to impact on them, whether rising tide lifts all boats, how he would receive that. We don't really know, but we do know that the Beach Boys were paying attention and in fact covering some Beatles songs.
They were paying attention. They covered Beatles songs. I seem to remember Brian saying something along the lines of he was scared, but he was scared into action.
Yes, motivated scared.
Motivated scared. And I seem to remember Rolling Stone put out the 250 greatest songs of the first 20 years of Rolling Stone's existence. And there was a brief interview with Brian Wilson in that issue. And he basically said the first time he heard the Beatles, his reaction was, again, scared, but made him competitive. And he went back to the other Beach Boys and said, come on, we got to get in there. We got to beat the Beatles, and that was his reaction.
I wonder if it was I Want to Hold Your Hand.
It probably was. I mean, that was the nuke.
Right.
That was the nuclear bomb.
Right.
That was the opening salvo. And so I have to imagine it was that, but not to the point where they couldn't enjoy the music of the Beatles. As you mentioned, they did a bunch of covers of Beatles songs.
Yeah, they were like album material, not something that they were putting out as singles, but Tell Me Why they did, right?
They did Tell Me Why, which was on the Party album, and they did You've Got to Hide Your Love Away. And later on, they did With a Little Help from My Friends.
Yes. There was a Beach Boys Rarities album. That was the first time I heard that.
Mm-hmm. The Beach Boys even did a cover of You Never Give Me Your Money.
Did they really?
Yeah, I heard the bootleg.
So it was like a studio recording they just didn't issue?
Yeah. The Beach Boys haven't issued more stuff than they've issued,
Wow.
But yeah, that's one of the ones.
I'll be damned. I'll have to look for that now. I thought they had done I Should Have Known Better.
They did that too. I think that was on the Party album.
Okay. That's funny. They're having the semi-live concept album of them having ostensibly a party. And what do you guys want to hear? How about some Beatles?
Yeah, exactly. How many acts do you know of that would be so into their competitors that they actually perform their songs,
Right. I can remember in my prime entry years of Beatlemania, which we're talking mid-70s, when I first heard their cover of rock and roll music, and I'm like, oh my God, make me puke, because I was so acclimated to the Beatles take on it, which is so razor sharp and rocking. And it's like, what the hell is this? Now I have a fondness for it, but at the time, it's like anything that even remotely encroached on Beatle territory was definitely blasphemous to me. I remember having that initial impression of that, and now it's like, okay, it's the Beach Boys, it's Mike Love, and it's okay for what it is.
And you were not exactly catching Brian Wilson at his best moment.
I suppose not.
When he produced that track.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was in a very specific period of his life at that point. And if you're into the beautiful melodies and the orchestrations and arrangements of the 60s Beach Boys, something like that is going to be like, huh? What?
Right.
I know that was my reaction when I was getting into the Beach Boys in the late 90s, early 2000s. And I finally made it to that album. And I got home and I put it on, and that was my reaction. It was like, huh? What?
Yeah, that's kind of how, fast forward how many years to when Kokomo came out. Like, what? Now, I've accepted rock and roll music, but this is a bridge too far.
Well, you can't blame Brian for that one.
No, I absolutely cannot, with all due respect. Right. So do you think it's likely, beyond the sense of competition, that going in 64, where the Beatles are inescapable and Beach Boys are solid, successful rock act at that time, although my impression, and I wasn't of age in 64 to look at them and form any meaningful impression on things, but when you see the Beach Boys Sullivan Show appearances, which followed the Beatles, it looks so dated and unhip with the matching Pendleton shirts and all that stuff, even though they got the cool hot rods on the stage. But it's like, wow, did they realize and how quickly that the ground was shifting beneath their feet really fast?
If they realized it, they did nothing about it for years, because 2 weeks before the Monterey Pop Festival, the Beach Boys were going to headline. And their act was still them wearing the striped shirts and doing fun, and all of the car songs and the girl songs. And they hadn't updated their act, really, even at that late stage.
And that's in the wake of Good Vibrations, which should have been the gateway, the early clue to the new direction at that point. And of course, we know that Smile Sessions followed, and that at the time of Monterey, June of 67, it was in limbo at that point, right? They'd stopped work on it.
Yeah, it was in limbo. They weren't sure what they were going to be doing. I think maybe at that point, Brian was shifting towards Smiley Smile, which was that stripped down sort of abandonment of everything that he had intended for Smile. And the reasons for them dropping out of Monterey have been just thrown out there, all conflicting reasons why they ultimately dropped out. But what they're all seem to be agreed upon is that it was Brian's call. And the speculation was, which is actually kind of sharp on Brian's part, is that he knew that the Beach Boys were going to come off as completely dated and completely out of touch with what was going on in the musical scene at that point. And he didn't want them to come off that way and appear with, The Who, Jimi Hendrix. And then they come out in their striped matching shirts and they're doing Fun, and Barbara Ann, Again, you're talking about 1964, whether they realized it or not. And again, my response to that would be, if they did know, they didn't do anything about it as far as 1967. I just think that they didn't have the kind of management that the Beatles did.
Or George Martin, that's going to facilitate. I mean, Brian is given a pretty free rein to a point, but I would say, this is my observation, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but unlike the Beatles and their record producer and implicitly their manager, they're all pulling in the same direction, wanting to expand the palette and take rock forward with every release. Whereas it seems like not only is Brian having resistance from Murray, his father, who's the ostensible manager at that time still, right?
No, he was fired around 64, 65?
Yeah, okay. That's the time I'm talking about.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah, as a reaction to the Beatles phenomenon, but also resistance from the guys in his band. It's almost a miracle that he got to make Pet Sounds at all in 66, because even Capitol, when it didn't do commercially what they thought it was going to do, and they immediately rush out a greatest hits album to make up the loss of sales, implicitly, the guys had given Brian his head, let him do what he thought was best, because he'd been guiding them creatively to this point. And when it, I wouldn't say blew up in their faces, but didn't do what they expected it to do, they sort of retreat. And it's like, okay, I guess the new direction isn't for us, at least at this time. So Brian's trying to push his boulder up the hill with his artistic ambitions. But he's playing a different sport from the rest of the guys. And he, unlike the Beatles, is pretty much left to his own devices. He doesn't have anybody pulling with him in the same direction.
There's a lot to that. In the years since, the reports that I've seen are that Pet Sounds sold a lot better than we or the Beach Boys were led to believe.
So it was based on chart performance, maybe, but it sold slowly?
It sold steadily, and the numbers were just better. And the Beach Boys found out about it years later. Pet Sounds performed better than Capitol would have had them believe otherwise. There was a lot of conflict between Capitol and the Beach Boys behind the scenes. So maybe they were trying to cook the book so that they didn't have to pay royalties or whatever, you know.
Or it forced them to do what they thought was commercial, and Pet Sounds wasn't it.
Eventually, the Beach Boys did sue Capitol for back royalties. So there was a lot of stuff going on there. But there's a lot to what you say about Brian basically going in one direction, and his father certainly, even after he was fired as their manager, he was still in the picture, of course. You can't fire your father, at least not in that family.
Okay, fellas, you got any guts? Let's hear it. Come on, Brian, knock it off. You guys think you're good? Let's go. Let's go. Fellas, as a team, we're unbeatable. Let's go. You're doing wonderful, Al. Enunciate. Let's go. Forget it.
Come on.
What's the matter? You made too much money, buddy?
No.
Let's sing from your heart, so let's go.
Right.
I've protected you for 22 years, but I can't go on if you're not going to listen to an intelligent man. Against many people that try to hurt you.
Are you going now?
No. This is awfully unfair for you to...
Are you going or staying? I don't know.
It's going what you want. If you want to fight for success, I'll go all out.
No, I don't. We don't do that. We would like to record under an atmosphere of calmness, and you're not presenting that.
Your mother loves you.
Look, we like to relax in a
First of
session.
all, you should never have all these people there.
Second of all, they're not saying anything. You're the one that's
talking. You forget to
talking.
sing from your hearts because you can't compete with their brains that are trying to hurt you.
Okay.
Please remember that you can only... I'm sorry. I can't talk anymore. You can only fight from the bottom of your hearts. When you forget to sing from your heart, you do it, but the other guys are coasting. You know why? Because you guys think you have an image.
Times are changing.
Don't ever forget.
Times are changing.
Getting a lot of resistance from Mike. And one of the big differences between the Beatles and the Beach Boys is that with the Beatles, you really did have two equals in Paul McCartney and John Lennon. And for the longest time, they were going in the same direction. They were very much in sync. With the Beach Boys, there was nobody else in that band on Brian's level. Mike Love might disagree, and he'd be the first to tell you.
And that's not to say that Carl or Dennis or Al were without talent. It took their talents a lot longer to flower, for sure.
Exactly.
Pacific Ocean Blue is a fine album from Dennis.
Yeah. And Carl emerged eventually as a really terrific producer. But even then, none of them had the vision or the drive or
the ambition.
Or we'll just say it, the talent that Brian did. And so when you've got the closest thing to your creative partner saying to you, hey, man, don't F with the formula. Right. And Brian was very insecure to begin with. And that's the other thing. Paul McCartney is very comfortable in his own skin.
Yes.
And there have been moments where he has lost confidence, but for the most part, he's not an insecure guy. Brian is a very, very insecure guy. And you have to keep pumping him up. And if he feels that you're not behind him 100%, he loses all confidence in himself. So with the perception that Pet Sounds was not the masterpiece, the greatest rock album of all time, which is what he wanted to make after hearing the US version of Rubber Soul. That was his reaction, is I want to make the greatest rock album of all time. And when the perception was that it wasn't, he just was very disappointed in it. At that point, he still had the momentum of what he felt he had accomplished with Pet Sounds going into the Smile sessions. But then you've got a real lack of faith on Mike Love's part and the constant badgering to the point where his creative partner on that album, Van Dyke Parks, drops out. He just can't take the pressure anymore. He can't take Mike Love constantly challenging him over the lyrics. And so then Brian really is all alone. And so he just kind of collapsed inward and basically was like, look, whatever you guys want, I'll just do it. that was the big difference, is that there was nobody else in that group who was of Brian's level, who had the clout to say, hey, listen, let's do this. This is the way to go. Let's trust in Brian. I trust in Brian. And who can make the kind of contributions that Brian was making. There just wasn't.
What an incredible amount of pressure as the guy. And he had to have the awareness that, yeah, Mike is going to write lyrics, because that didn't seem to ever be Brian's strong point. It was conceptualizing and putting the music together and orchestrating and arranging and all that stuff. But he would bring in, from the earliest days, other outside lyricists, DJs and people like that to help facilitate that part. So you have the confidence being undermined by his father, by their label, by his bandmates, not having somebody as an equal that not only will keep you propped up, but will fire you up in the way that he was remotely inspired from the Beatles, but they didn't have a Beatle in his own band to do that. Even if you wanted to go back, like we were talking about before the taping, talking about these two guys born 2 days apart, both extremely innately gifted musically, coming from fathers who made music, Jim Mack and Murray Wilson, to varying degrees of whatever successes they had, but certainly they were key influences on them growing up, even if they weren't consciously trying to foist a life as a musician and recording artist and composer onto their sons. That just flowered naturally from the environment and whatever innate talents they inherited. But unlike Paul, who had an extremely nurturing father that would show him things and would encourage him, would challenge him once in a while, yes, 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 instead of yeah, yeah, yeah. But at least it was a warm, friendly, supportive environment. And everything you've ever read about Murray Wilson, it's an endless nightmare as children and how they all reacted in different ways. Brian just his psyche being fractured at an early age, and Dennis acting out, and Carl internalizing. It's like they all responded to that tyranny in different ways. So he didn't have that supportive foundation that Paul did, and yet he achieved what he did. But it just seems like it was doomed to implode because there was nothing keeping him propped up other than whatever praise he was getting, maybe from the record-buying public or whoever was around him to encourage him, but it was not a full-time support.
Yeah, you're 100% right. And you can't sort of categorize Murray in black and white terms. I mean, there was some good that he did instill in Brian, the drive, the competitive drive, that came from Murray. And it's kind of like the toxic relationship. And when you're defending the toxic person, it's like, well, he loves you in his own way.
Right.
And that was the deal with Murray, because Murray quit his job. He had a pretty successful job, and he quit it and threw himself into managing the Beach Boys full time. And he really put a lot into it. I mean, he wanted them to be successful.
So it's kind of a Tom Parker thing?
Well, I think it was more of a stage dad thing. I think he was trying to live vicariously through them. And he wanted to take their success and kind of glom onto it himself, because he put out an album, and
yes,
he used to
the many moods.
And he used to go around and give people buttons saying, "I met Brian Wilson's dad." It was like it was like that kind of thing. He was a stage parent, but without him, you can make the argument that the Beach Boys wouldn't have been as successful. He got them through the door. He got them their initial deals, and it was his pushing that got Brian that first producer's credit. That was something that Murray had pushed for Brian, because Brian was already doing it. He just wasn't getting the credit for it.
Huh. Interesting.
Yeah. So there was a lot of good that came out of Murray as well, but he was a troubled soul, just like his son. And so Paul did come from a completely different kind of background. His father wasn't competing with him. That's a big difference.
This is going to be a hell of a hit. Let's go. Loosen up. Loosen up a little.
Right.
So, Dad, Brian, I'm a genius too. Let's go, huh?
They're reacting to the Beatles' success. And we have that quote from John, and then going into 66, Pet Sounds, which, as we know, there was the story. I think it was Bruce Johnston that brought it to England and gave like a listening party that John and Paul attended. And at that point, they're midway through the Revolver sessions. A song like Here, There, and Everywhere obviously has sort of the standard trappings of the Beach Boys sound in terms of harmonies. It's the sort of slow ballad in my room sort of sound. I don't think there's anything specific to Pet Sounds that impacted Revolver at that point, because it was well underway and they already had their vision. And I don't know if anything came of it that you can directly say, oh yeah, that's them taking a page off that album.
In McCartney's recent book, The Lyrics, he specifically cites Pet Sounds and God Only Knows as the inspiration for Here, There, and Everywhere. And it seemed implausible to me until I looked at the chronology. I looked at the release dates for all this stuff, And Pet Sounds was released on May 16th, 1966. We know that the Beatles recorded Here, There, and Everywhere toward the end of the sessions for Revolver. So like you said, most of Revolver was done at that point. So they recorded Here, There, and Everywhere in mid to late June, right? And so I couldn't find out exactly when Paul came up with the idea for Here, There, and Everywhere and actually wrote and composed it. But it seems to me that if Paul heard Pet Sounds and God Only Knows around the time that stuff came out, which would be mid to late May, that gives him roughly a month to come up with Here, There, and Everywhere. So maybe Pet Sounds didn't influence Revolver as a whole, but at the very least, I think it could be argued that it could have sparked the creation of Here, There, and Everywhere, which in and of itself is pretty wonderful.
Yeah, it's definitely a feather in the cap for Brian if Paul, in fact, did take it from any off Pet Sounds. But I would say, in general, if he was going for a Beach Boys type pastiche, which more clearly he was later on with Back in USSR by way of Chuck Berry, good on Brian. But I know that he had said later on that he was actually thinking of Marianne Faithfull when he was performing the song. So that gives you a whole other thing that he's throwing into the mix. But lyrics, I would have happily availed myself as a fact checker for that thing if they wanted to go that route, but clearly they didn't.
I think he says something very similar in many years from now also. And that was 25 years ago?
Yeah, and 95-ish, something like that. Yeah.
Certainly the link from Pet Sounds to Here, There, and Everywhere is not as clear as, say, looking at it reversely, that Ticket to Ride begot Girl Don't Tell Me.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. If you listen to Girl Don't Tell Me, which is on Summer Days, Summer Nights.
Okay. So this would have been summer of 65?
Yeah.
Because Ticket to Ride came out in April. So they would have had, at that point, it didn't come out on the Help album until August, but as a single, it preceded the album by a few months there.
Supposedly, Brian wrote Girl Don't Tell Me, having heard Ticket to Ride. He wrote it with John Lennon in mind and claimed that he even thought about giving it to the Beatles. Only Brian Wilson could say something like that.
Right.
He acknowledged that people said it sounded like Ticket to Ride, but he also said he didn't mean for it to sound like any one particular song of theirs. He was going for that feel. You cannot listen to Girl Don't Tell Me and not hear Ticket to Ride.
Yes, indeed.
But he just described it as, it was messages that were sent back and forth across the ocean, and that, they would do something and he would hear it and then he would want to do something just as good. And so that is clearly a case of direct inspiration. And I don't disagree with you in that it's harder to sort of see a direct link between God Only Knows and Here and There and Everywhere.
I would think there's probably a more substantial case to be made, Pet Sounds as a whole influencing the direction of Pepper, which got underway months later after both Pet Sounds and the Good Vibrations single. Late November 66 sessions, starting with Strawberry Fields, went up 64, and then Penny Lane going into Pepper, that they absolutely were paying attention, just like they were paying attention to Freak Out and any number of things that were going on where they're really trying to pivot away from what had been their standard operating procedure with their albums to that point.
I'm going to throw something at you that I found out during my research for my Time Special Edition about Paul McCartney, which I never knew. And I don't even know how to react to it, but I'll throw this out to you. According to Van Dyke Parks, who was Brian Wilson's lyricist on Smile, he claimed that the Beatles, and he didn't specify which Beatles, he just said the Beatles, they were in California in late 66, early 67, and they were visiting one of the studios where the Beach Boys were recording Smile. And they got to hear some of the Smile tracks without Brian being there. Okay, Brian was not there. Derek Taylor, who had been the Beatles publicist in the early 60s and then left and became the Beach Boys publicist for a while. This would have been around that time. Derek Taylor was working for the Beach Boys at that time. So during this period, the Beatles get a listen to some of the Smile stuff. And this is before they're recording Sgt. Pepper. So Van Dyke Parks, this is a quote from him, okay? Derek Taylor was planted as a scout for the Beatles. And they wanted to get a sense of what the Beach Boys were up to. So they planted Derek Taylor into the Beach Boys camp so that when they were in America, they could get access to what the Beach Boys were up to.
That's 11th level chess going on there.
When I first read this, I mean, this is like QAnon worthy.
Yeah,
you know,
right.
I mean, this is like, and here's the thing, even if it was true, I challenge anyone to listen to Sgt. Pepper and relate it to anything that's on Smile, with the exception of barnyard animals doing sound effects.
Right. That's pretty straight correlation there. But all this stuff is extremely well documented with studio logs. So people know, as well as their movements. And I know that Paul came to California in early 67. I think it was well after Pepper was underway. It might have even been mostly finished in April of 67. There's a photo of him with Paul Kantner. Do you know about that? I think he still has the stash, so we know at what point he shaved it off.
It vaguely rings a bell. Vaguely rings a bell.
Yeah. But at that point, I think it would have been a little late in the game for them suddenly to be, in his head, repurposing what he'd heard of the Smile in progress, bringing it back to England, and suddenly steering the direction of Pepper at that point.
Right. And Brian heard about it, if it happened. I think Van Dyke Park said that Brian heard about it and got really sort of paranoid. But the thing is that Paul visited the Beach Boys in the studio during the Smile sessions in April 1967.
So same trip. Is that when Vegetables was cut?
Yeah. And so depending on who you speak to, either Paul performed on Vegetables or Paul was in the studio booth and was actually giving direction to Al Jardine. So Brian couldn't have been that upset about it if he's letting Paul, you know.
That's hilarious that Van Dyke is saying this. And you know what? He's still around. He's apparently still lucid. I would love to track him down and see if I could pin him down on this. Because you know what? I'll share this little vignette with you. When I did my Revolver book, and I mentioned, I'm trying to remember, maybe I was talking about Pet Sounds. I can't remember, but I mentioned Van Dyke Parks. I'm well aware of who he was. I know that he plays organ on the Byrds 5D album, and yes, he was a collaborator with Brian on what didn't become the Smile album. But in any event, in establishing who he was, I said he was a former child actor, and that I'd heard that he played Tommy Manicotti on The Honeymooners when he was a kid in the 50s. Did you ever hear that?
I never heard that.
Okay. And I immediately, doing my research, go to IMDb, look up the credits. No, it's another kid playing Tommy Manicotti. So I put the book out, and then he gloms onto it somehow. Somebody must have brought it to his attention. And so he does a tweet or Instagram post about it, trying to discredit me in the entire book for, he could have just checked with me. I did play Tommy Manicotti. Number one, it was under a different name. And number two, apparently it was in the Lost episodes and not in the classic 39.
Oh,
so,
okay.
And I said, okay, well, maybe time to update your IMDb credits, but sorry, my bad.
Wow. Mind blown. Okay. All right.
Yeah. So who among us has seen that iteration of Tommy Manicotti? I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, it's not like the classic 39 are the ones that have been in circulation constantly. The Lost episodes, I mean, just try to track those down these days.
Yeah, exactly. I remember the big splash in the 80s when they revealed them, but frankly, they were harder to watch. And that's kind of how they stayed. Yeah, because of the telescopes.
They should have stayed lost, most of them. But anyway, so I found that quote in Dominic Priori's book about Smile. It's called Smile, the Story of Brian Wilson's Lost Masterpiece. And that's where I found those quotes from Van Dyke about the Beatles sending Derek Taylor in as their covert operative. I mean, it sounds crazy. I mean, it's so crazy it might have actually happened.
Right, exactly. And Derek Taylor was a multi-leveled individual for sure.
For sure, yeah. But again, I mean, in terms of what ultimately sunk Smile were the Beatles. According to some of the people in the inner circle of the Beach Boys, they were recording Smile. And supposedly Brian was driving and Strawberry Fields came on the radio for the first time. And Brian pulled the car over and said, that's it. The race is over and they won.
They got there first.
And after that, The Smile sessions continued in dribs and drabs, but all the spark had run out of him at that point.
Yeah, the mojo was gone.
And so we have the Beatles to thank.
Damn them. Now, have you listened to the latter-day iterations? I know that Brian presented one, a new version, and then there's been these box sets of reconfiguring what exists on tape. And I don't think, clearly, not everything was finished that was originally envisioned, is my understanding. Do you know that stuff well enough to comment on it?
You just opened the can of worms. I not only have all of the released versions of Smile and the Smile sessions, but I've got like hours of bootlegs. And the funny thing is I had a lot of the bootlegs before the Beach Boys put out that official box set. So I went through all of these hours of bootlegs and had the officially released Brian Wilson version. And the bottom line is that it seemed like the Beach Boys were a lot closer to finishing that album than the legend would have you believe. A lot of the pieces were there. It's just they needed to nail down some vocals. They needed to nail down some lyrics, which Van Dyke actually came back in 2004 and contributed those lyrics to the Brian Wilson version. All of the pieces were more or less there. It's just that Brian couldn't figure out how those puzzle pieces would go together because he was recording everything in a modular fashion, the way he recorded Good Vibrations. And so as the project became just bigger and bigger and his mental health was on the decline, he was headed for another nervous breakdown, he just couldn't do it. But if you listen to the Brian Wilson version, which sounds like a complete work to me, and you listen to everything that the Beach Boys had finished at that point before the whole thing collapsed, they were pretty far along and they didn't have much further to go to wrap everything up, from my estimation. It's just that I read somewhere that one of the things that Brian was really concerned about was there was an album that was recorded before The Who's Tommy. It was another rock opera.
Pretty Things?
The Pretty Things, that was it. And it came out after Tommy, and so they seemed like they were chasing after The Who. It was a similar situation in that Brian was afraid that Smile would always be seen as chasing the tail of Sgt. Pepper.
Yeah, a problem that the Stones didn't have with Satanic Majesties, apparently.
They were a lot more shameless than the Beach Boys were. You know?
I guess so.
But yeah, I mean, obviously, that was one of the things that I gleaned is that Brian didn't want to have that kind of similar situation.
That kind of baggage of being a copyist.
Yeah, following them, even though he had been working on it all along.
Right. Something that popped into my head that is not germane to anything other than it just popped into my head was those early performances of the Beach Boys on the Sullivan Show where they've got the Rickenbacker guitars. Now, we know the story of the Byrds seeing the Beatles in A Hard Day's Night. Instantly, Roger McGuinn, Jim McGuinn, picks up a Rickenbacker, and that becomes the basis of their career right out of the box, the Rickenbacker 12-string. Do we know if the Beach Boys were already playing Rickenbackers before the Beatles popularized them, or is that something, because obviously the Beatles weren't the first customer of Rickenbacker guitars.
I don't know, actually. That's just an area that I never really delved into.
Yeah, somebody listening to this will know that. I'm just kind of curious because it seems like when they were covering Beatle material in 65, that didn't seem to bother them as being viewed as following the Beatles' lead because I think their own artistry was so strong that they were secure enough and they were selling boatloads of records that they didn't have to feel worried about that. But the Brian Wilson of 64 is a very different Brian Wilson from 67.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. It's really night and day. Did you ever see the Tammy Show?
Oh, yeah.
I think it's in it's in the Tammy Show where they're all there and Mike's doing that spiel about, you know, how this is how the Beach Boys perform a song. And we've got Dennis gets on the drums and then Carl starts doing his guitar lick. And then our leader, Brian, and that guy just didn't exist anymore. That guy couldn't even get on a stage pretty much by
late 64. Yeah.
Yeah. So he was a completely different person by that point. After he had the nervous breakdown in 64 and became studio bound, my understanding is he didn't take to a stage again until the summer of 67, where the Beach Boys went to Hawaii and they took him with them to just help him chill out because he was a wreck.
They promised him lots of sand.
And so they actually did a few live shows in Hawaii. In fact, I don't think Bruce Johnson went with them on that trip. Brian did and performed with them on stage, and they were going to put it out as a live album called Late in Hawaii.
Oh, wow. That's interesting that it seems like late 66 is when the Monkees first played in front of the public as a live band. And they sort of programmed it to be in Hawaii so that in case it sucked, nobody would see it anyway.
Exactly. That album actually never came out. It was heavily bootlegged, and some of the tracks actually did make it into the public release a few years ago. And the rights were about to expire, and so they were putting stuff out on the internet so they could maintain the copyright. So pretty much at this point, the whole Late in Hawaii album is out there. But what the Beach Boys tried to do is they tried to re-record the whole album in the studio, and they were going to add sound effects of an audience.
Surf sounds.
and to top it off, Bruce Johnson, I keep calling him Brian. Bruce Johnson, who wasn't
from AC/DC.
Exactly, yeah, which really would have blown people's minds.
Right.
But he wasn't with them in Hawaii, and yet he participated in the studio recordings that were going to purport to be. It was bizarre.
So it's slipped out, but not as an official release, just one of these sort of copyright renewal things?
Officially, but the tracks had been circulating on bootlegs for many, many years.
And so these are post-Monterey, 67?
Yeah, I think this would have been post-Monterey. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. So they missed Monterey, even though the Beach Boys, I thought, were like officially part of the organization panel.
They were.
Yeah, the Beatles and what's his name?
Papa John Phillips.
Yeah, Lou Adler. That's what I was thinking of.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Beach Boys were going to either headline the second night or the third or the last night of Monterey, and they pulled out.
So, but for the Beatles and but for Strawberry Fields, if Brian had kept it together enough for Smile to come out, that would have been the opportunity to show the new reinvented Beach Boys. Yes, it would have been maybe concurrent with Pepper, but the Beatles weren't playing on stage at that point. So they might have been able to establish a foothold of credibility in their own right. Plus, they could hide behind, the association would be the proxy for the early Beach Boys, the square guys in matching suits on the same bill at Monterey. So they'd have that cover.
Well, that was the other problem. That's one of the other theories as to why the Beach Boys dropped out of Monterey, was because how do you perform the Smile tracks live on stage?
With an orchestra.
Well,
with the Wrecking Crew.
I don't know if that was in the cards for them. I don't know if they were in a position to be able to put that kind of money up.
And maybe just not have the vision, because there was no real precedent for that. Because I always maintained that the Beatles quit touring, but Paul, certainly among them, still has the itch for performing live. And you got Brian leasing the Savile Theatre in London. Why the hell couldn't they do like a week-long, 2-week, month-long residency there with an orchestra and play Pepper live? Let the world come to them. But nobody had that kind of conceptualizing of a live rock presentation then.
Exactly. That was one of the arguments that I think Carl Wilson, who was supposedly one of the most supportive members of the band in terms of the Smile stuff, he claimed he loved it. But I think even he said to Brian, certainly I know Mike Love did, said to him, how the hell are we going to do this on stage, Brian? Because they were still very much a touring band, the Beach Boys.
Yeah.
And so they probably didn't want to go to Monterey and just do car songs and girl songs. But the new stuff that they were doing, if you heard some of the live stuff that the Beach Boys were doing from that period, from what became Smiley Smile, but what at the time was Smile, if you hear Heroes and Villains, which Brian did perform in Hawaii in 1967, summer of 67, it is sparse. It's Brian on a Hammond organ, and there is nothing to it. It's so empty. Good Vibrations was like a ghost of itself. It was like a shell. And so you do get a sense of what they would have sounded like. And you would have had an audience that I think would have been very kind of disengaged.
Yeah.
Not even what the hell is this? I think it's just like, this is kind of pathetic. This is sad,
Yeah. That's quite the corner they painted themselves into.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess it depends on the act and what your strong suit is, because I think about The Who. And Tommy obviously is a much more produced album than their live performance of it ever was, because until like decades later, and they were doing it as a thing, which is totally separate from 1969, 1970, where it's just the same three instrumentalists and Roger as always. French horns, all that stuff, forget about that. You're not going to get that. They saw it as two different animals. And when you have something like Smile and Pepper, which are far more produced, they probably could not have seen a way to do that. What makes me curious is 67 is a year of Moody Blues, Days of Future Past, and a lot of that is Mellotron. I wonder if they ever tried to pull that stuff off live and were able to get away with it.
That's a really good question.
Yeah, I really don't know, but I'd be curious because that might have been pointing the way, because live rock performance between 67 and 69 evolved so quickly, where it had been kind of stagnant the 4 years up until. I guess the changing of the art is what forced the changing of the live presentation.
Absolutely. And it's funny you mentioned about Tommy, because, John Entwistle, up until his dying day, said he always felt that the Tommy album, those were the demos, that they never actually finished the album.
Right.
Because it was so
that live was the way to experience it. Yeah.
So it's funny that you pointed that out. But with all of that stuff, I think even Brian succumbed to the notion that he painted himself into a corner. And so you listen to stuff like Smiley Smile, Wild Honey, which is a great album, but very shifting away from that production sound that the Beach Boys had earlier.
And it really is them with that post-Smile collection of work, the next several albums, Smiley Smile and Wild Honey and Friends, they are really sort of forced to innovate and change direction and reinvent themselves absent Brian at the controls. And Carl steps up, and they are at a point that maybe they sustained it through the early 70s, because I know that by the time they were bringing Blondie Chaplin into the group in 72, 73, whenever it was, they were really, albeit different from the 60s Brian Wilson-led band, they were still quite viable, putting some great stuff out on record. Like, it took the collapse of Brian to bring those guys to step up in a way that they weren't while he was still healthy.
That's true. Brian's kind of become mythologized after Smile and stayed in his bed until 1976. That's not really true. Brian was actually more involved in the post-Smile albums than legend would have you believe.
If not doing the heavy lifting the way he had been.
Right. But if you look at the initial credits list, the listing for Wild Honey, it originally said produced by Brian Wilson, and somebody went in and crossed it out and said produced by the Beach Boys. So the going theory is that Brian was pretty involved with Wild Honey in terms of the production, but he no longer wanted the credit because he didn't feel like he was doing everything that he had been doing. And so he willingly, because the other guys were now having much more say, he made the call.
Yeah, more egalitarian.
Right. But initially, that album was going to have the credit produced by Brian Wilson.
Huh,
we had the track list. I saw the track list and it said produced by Brian. Anyway, and he was heavily involved with Friends. That was probably the last album for a long time that he was heavily involved in. He came back to a certain degree of activity with Sunflower, but it was never what it was. It was never what it was. And that is the big difference between Paul and Brian, is that they both had what can be called nervous breakdowns. I mean, Paul has admitted that in the aftermath of the Beatles breakup, he came pretty close to basically having a nervous breakdown to the point where he was drinking a lot and staying in bed. Sound familiar?
Yeah.
The big difference is that, he was able to pull himself out of it and come back stronger than ever. The same can't be said for Brian.
Yeah, that's an interesting comparison, because had the Beach Boys split around that time, Paul basically lost his musical environment, that framework that he'd had to that point. And therefore, if he's going to pull himself out of this funk and this depression, and Linda's pushing him, you're a musician, make music for Christ's sake. Brian didn't have that similar situation. He still had that existing framework, which was the band he'd always known. And where does he fit into it now? His old role has changed. That's different. So now what am I going to do?
He had been toying with the idea of leaving the Beach Boys or going off and doing his own thing, I guess as early as 66, because Caroline No was released as a Brian Wilson single. So the idea had been floating in his head. But here's the other difference. The Beach Boys were not just his band. It was mostly his family. And so he constantly had his father and his brothers and his cousin and even his wife basically saying, you have a responsibility to your family. They are counting on you. And so he was always getting pulled back in to this entity that I think he had been looking to break away from for quite a while. If you read the story, this is a guy who really didn't want to be a Beach Boy anymore, didn't want the pressure of being a Beach Boy, the obligations and the responsibility as far back as 66, maybe even earlier.
So it's like the mob.
Yeah, exactly. And there is a tie there, a connection there that even the Beatles didn't have. They weren't family. They weren't blood relatives.
Right. They were not obliged to be in each other's pockets anymore after 69.
Had they let Brian go, had he gone off, there were moments of potential that he displayed, and any moment of greatness that Brian was sort of looking to have on his own, once the Beach Boys got wind of it, they snagged it and pulled it back for themselves.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. There's this great song called Time to Get Alone. Did you know that song?
I know the title. What album is that?
It's on Wild Honey, actually. And Brian had discovered a band called Redwood and was working with them, and he had basically given them Time to Get Alone. And what happened was Mike and Carl got wind of it, and they showed up at the studio and took Brian aside. He was going to produce this track for Redwood. It was going to be a single, and Brian was going to produce it. He'd written it, and Mike and Carl took Brian aside, had a long talk with him in the control room. And after a while, he comes out all forlorn, looks like he's got tears about to roll out of his eyes. And he tells Redwood, I'm sorry, guys, you can't have the song. The Beach Boys want it, and I've got to do it with them. So he took all the instrumental tracks and reused them for the Beach Boys version and just added the Beach Boys vocals to it. Redwood became Three Dog Night.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Redwood became Three Dog Night, and Brian wanted to produce them. And the Beach Boys' position was, listen, we're your first obligation. You can't give A-list material to other bands when we're scrambling around and your head's in the clouds and we're counting on you and you're not delivering for us, but you're going to deliver for non-family members. And that's the kind of pressure that he was under.
Didn't a similar situation happen a few years before with Jan and Dean, where he gave away a song that they thought should have been theirs?
Yes, but in that case, he actually did it.
Yeah,
yeah. That's what made them so adamant, because it had happened before.
Yes, okay. You're not going to do it to us twice.
Yeah, so that's the kind of pressure he was under. But that's an example of him trying to break away and do other stuff. And who knows what could have happened if they just let him do it.
Right, and it's not as though their recording of it is this hit single that because they seized it back, they were able to capitalize and get some more life out of it. It just became an album track, right? It was not something that they got any particular special notice for. Yeah,
but at that point, they were really seeing their fortunes they were taking it on the chin. The recording happened in 67, 68, but it didn't make it onto an album until 2020, which was 69, which basically a collection of outtakes. I thought it was Wild Honey because I'm pretty sure that the song was recorded in 67, 68.
Right, it would make sense if it came from those sessions and then it just didn't filter out till 69, the year they're collaborating with Manson.
So, no, that was 68. To be fair, that was 68.
But it made it to 2020, right?
But we made it on to 2020, yeah.
Uh-huh.
So Time to Get Alone.
He was busy in 69.
But yeah, Time to Get Alone made it onto the 2020 album. And yeah, clearly the man had an eye for talent because Redwood, like I said, became Three Dog Night. Danny Hutton was one of his best friends at the time.
That's right. Yeah, I was aware of that relationship. I didn't know about the Redwood story. That's interesting.
And the other thing is that the Redwood track with their vocals is now out there.
Oh, is it?
You can hear it, yeah. But it's the same orchestration. It's the same musical tracks. It's just the vocals changed.
It is interesting that the Beatles, as far back as 63 and with the Beatles, were getting validation from savvy music observers. I'm thinking of William Mann in The Standard writing about alien cadences and Not a Second Time and just giving him this credibility on a songwriting level. And something similar happening with the Beach Boys, I want to say late 66, when that Leonard Bernstein special, which aired in early 67 about the pop makers and Brian doing Surf's Up. What a feather in the cap that must have been for him, from the guy who's basically the minister of culture in America at the time, Leonard Bernstein, to get that kind of acknowledgement of a pop record and what he's doing innovation-wise in his compositions, well past the point of Surfing USA.
And believe me, Brian and his team used those quotes from that show for decades.
Yeah, I'm sure Derek Taylor's all over that.
He took a lot of pride in that. You know, the same kind of pride when McCartney said that God Only Knows is one of the greatest songs ever written. So yeah, he really got a lot of mileage out of that recognition.
Yeah, that's great. It's too bad it didn't get more wind in his sails in terms of the pressure he would be able to exert on his band members to get Smile finished at the time. But Maybe it was just past that point with his degrading psyche at that point and copious drug use, if we're being honest.
Oh, yeah. And you also have to just take into account, it's not just the drug use, it's the mental health issues. After all of that collapsed, he never wanted Surf's Up to ever see the light of day. And they really, really had to twist his arm to let it be released in 71 for the Surf's Up album.
That's an incredible gestation period for a magnificent recording.
Yeah. My feeling is that at the very least, I'm kind of dubious about if Smile had been released in 67, whether it would have helped them or whether it would have confounded the audience and they would have just walked away from the Beach Boys entirely. You know, they might have gained a whole new audience, but I think a very sort of particular audience. And I think their mainstream audience who had been listening to them since 62 would have just said, all right, that's it. We're done. We're done with this group. Because it's a very dense conceptual album that isn't very listener friendly. And the lyrics don't make a lot of sense if you try to really analyze them. It's a beautiful sounding album and the lyrics are beautiful for the feel that they give. But if you're somebody who's reading the lyrics and trying to have it tell you a story, it's very abstract. But I think that nobody could deny the beauty of Surf's Up. And I think that track alone, because Heroes and Villains did make it out. I think it hit number 12. So it wasn't a huge hit for them.
No, but for a song as abstract as that, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah. And Surf's Up was even more abstract, but it's a beautiful song. And I remember hearing it for the first time when I was first getting into the Beach Boys. And I was like, whoa, 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 what is that? That is gorgeous. And I've tried to figure out what the lyrics mean. And every time I listen to it, I think it means something else. Maybe that's a good thing.
Sure. That's art.
And I think that song had it come out in 67. I think people would have taken notice. I don't know how much of a commercial hit it would have been, but I think it would have made some kind of impact. Wow, that's the Beach Boys? Wow.
Yeah. It just seems like they've got, in hindsight, all the ingredients for really flipping the script in 67 to get this gravitas, the hip cachet.
Yeah.
That the whole world, the whole rock scene is flipping. You know, they would have been taking a risk just the same as the Beatles, who no longer are touring, no longer are mop tops, have got varying degrees of facial hair going on, changing their image completely, and putting out this just complete departure from everything they'd ever done before, meant as some kind of thematic work from start to finish. Whether you can divine a concept in that or not is beside the point. It just projects a unity and a gravitas that nothing before that had. It was an event. And without being seen as copyists, because they're working parallel paths at the same time. And they would have had that stage at Monterey. Yes, I know, we've discussed they couldn't maybe have pulled it off sonically, but even if they hadn't, if it still skipped out on Monterey, put out Smile, put out Surf's Up, just showed where they really were in 67, at least Brian, they might have had a chance had all the guys been on the same page and believed in it and projected that. But you can kind of tell, we're just kind of going along for the ride here. We're not really sure about this. What do you think? If it sold by the ton that year, then maybe that would have been enough to win them over and be secure in, well, maybe we should trust Brian's instincts. He knows where to go because every step of the way, he's thinking what hasn't been done yet and not recycling past formulas. So it's a lot of what ifs when I think about that period.
And that's the thing. It's supposedly George Harrison wasn't completely on board for Sgt. Pepper, but it certainly didn't hurt the process, the creative process and the recording process and bring that project to fruition. Maybe George in his own way was more supportive of Sgt. Pepper than the skeptics and the Beach Boys were for Smile. But as we said earlier, Paul, and John has actually said this, that Paul was in the zone during Sgt. Pepper. Nobody was going to sway Paul, and nobody was going to convince Paul that he wasn't right about where things were going.
Yeah, there's an implicit trust there. And in contrast to the Beach Boys, it's not like George and Ringo and John were trying to drag Paul back to She Loves You.
Right? Exactly. Exactly. And that's a big difference. And what I think is just charming is that you can see Brian, even though Brian, kind of checked out for the most part after Smile, but the impact that he had on Paul continued for years, going into the solo years.
Oh, yes. Let's talk about that.
Oh, okay.
So, as we know, as established that maybe it's from Pet Sounds on that Paul's listening to the Beach Boys with both ears.
Yeah. Yeah.
So he participates to whatever degree, whether he's crunching or supervising on vegetables in 67. So clearly, as far as we know, that might have been the first time they were actually together hanging out.
They had met once before, at least once before. Derek Taylor said that he arranged for Paul and Brian to meet face to face in August 66.
Okay, so when they're on tour for the last time and they're passing through LA. Okay.
And during that time, Brian played Paul an early acetate of Good Vibrations.
Oh, cool. That's new. I didn't know that.
Yeah, that was according to Derek Taylor, and that happened in August 66. And then Paul visited in April 67, and I guess that was the visit where Paul got on the piano and played for Brian and Brian's wife, She's Leaving Home, that visit.
That would have been the one to play.
Yeah. And then the next time Paul had contact that I know of with one of the Beach Boys was when they were in India and he was with Mike Love. And he gave Mike Love this bit of advice, which is you really have to work on your album covers. Because you had Rubber Soul, you had Revolver, you had Sgt. Pepper, and Pet Sounds. You look at the cover of Pet Sounds, you don't necessarily get the sense that this is one of the greatest albums of all time.
It's like if George Martin had gotten his way with Please Please Me about taking a picture of them in front of the insect house at the London Zoo. You know, it's that kind of like literal thinking. And this is the Beach Boys with Pet Sounds. Like, really? You're going to put us with a bunch of animals?
So that was the advice that Paul gave Mike Love, which was you really have to work on your album covers.
Smart guy.
But to the point which does give credence to, Paul was paying attention to the Beach Boys.
Mm-hmm. The one obvious thing that comes up pretty quickly after the Beatles end that you can point to without fear of contradiction as, oh yeah, he's been listening to Brian Wilson, is Dear Boy on Ram.
Oh, I thought you were going to say The Backseat of My Car.
Oh, well, same album.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah. Dear Boy. Wow, I never made that connection, believe it or not.
Well, the backing vocals is mostly the orchestration of those harmony parts. That.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I was so focused on Backseat of My Car that I guess that just kind of like slipped past me. But now that you mention it, that makes perfect sense.
Sure. Yeah. And just in general, in marked contrast to the McCartney album, which of course was conceived under different circumstances, I've long held the private view, and sometimes I talk about it, I don't know if there's any validity to it, is that where he puts out the McCartney album, I think it started out as this semi-experimental album of musical doodlings, and only after he heard Instant Karma, where John is finally competing on Beatle level, not this experimental cold turkey, give peace a chance, lo-fi, Life with the Lions crap. This is actually a commercial record, which hits number 3 below Let It Be at number 1, where Paul is forced to raise his game. So he runs into the studio in London and tosses out Maybe I'm Amazed and Every Night. So that sort of alters the concept a little bit. But I think that one made it to number 1. So it did well commercially, but got crucified by critics, notably Rolling Stone. The guy had to rewrite his review because Jan Wenner said, no, this is not just a pop collection. This is a statement, and you must grade him on his statement. So he rebounds like, oh, you didn't like that. So then he returns to the Abbey Road style production with Ram. Studio pros, orchestration, brass, everything, which in his head, at least, the way he's putting it together, where you've got individual songs that are sort of mini suites, none more than Uncle Albert, Admiral Halsey. To me, that was very Beach Boys in spirit, if not an actual record you can point to. So I think that he was responding to the way he was being received by critics, and that gets slammed, that gets crucified. So then he invents Wings and does this record in a week, rough mix, spontaneity exercise with Wildlife that they don't like that. So it's like, where do I go from there?
Well, they were mad at him.
Of course. We know that now. It's crystal clear now. But at the time, he's like, what do you want from me?
Right. They wanted him to go away.
Right. A tone.
Yeah. It's funny because a friend of mine, he's a writer and a former rock critic, J.M. Mattis, and I was talking to him about all of this not too long ago. I never thought about this, but he said that he felt the Brian Wilson influence on Paul carried over as far down the road as Flowers in the Dirt, and he used Motor of Love as an example. And I was like, I never thought of that. And I went and played Motor of Love, and I said, yeah, I could see that. I could see that.
Very lush.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a well-loved track of Paul's, I think mostly because it just goes on longer probably than it needs to. But I thought it was, and I liked the vinyl version because it didn't have Ulu Soleil, whatever the hell that other thing is tacked onto the end, which kind of kills the end note of the album. I thought Motor of Love was a perfectly fine ending to that album. You didn't need to add anything to it. And I hadn't thought of it in the Brian Wilson sense before, but that does make sense to me.
Yeah, I never had Flowers in the Dirt on vinyl. So for me, it was a US Le Soleil. It was always the last track. I never heard it without it. But yeah, it just seemed like it became part of his DNA. And he would always like pop it out whenever you wouldn't expect it.
And you could see where they had a common sensibility if you analyze them in terms of influences. They both clearly loved pre-rock and roll music. They both clearly loved harmonies. They both were so unbelievably musically inventive when it came to just licks and hooks and odd song structurings. So they've got a ton in common. It makes you kind of wonder what would have happened if those two come the 70s when Brian really could have used Paul's help, if he'd reached out to him and they'd worked on something together. Would it have worked, or was he scared of Brian at that point? I don't know if I want to get sucked into this.
Well, thinking about where things were in the 70s, we know that Paul reached out to Brian and made an effort to sort of interact with Brian during the 70s. I mean, he was at Brian's 34th birthday party.
Yes, during the Wings Over America tour, or just after, there's that footage.
There's the footage of them throwing a birthday party for Brian that made it into that TV special, the Beach Boys Summer of 76.
Yeah.
TV special. So Paul was there. There's another story about how Paul went to visit Brian, and Brian was in a bad state, and he like ran into the pool house and locked himself in and wouldn't come out and all that. So Paul had made efforts to at least
socially engage him.
Right. In terms of working together, I think it could have been incredible. The collaborations that we've got, I treasure them only because they're so rare. One is basically Paul sang on a Brian Wilson song called A Friend Like You, which was on Brian's 2004 album, Getting In Over My Head. So it's like Paul just basically does a guest vocal.
Were they physically together for that? Did they actually record it in the same studio, or was that one of those send a tape in the mail and I'll return it to you?
I think they might have actually recorded it together, because I think I've seen photographs from that recording session, if I'm not mistaken.
Would have been during the Heather Mills era.
2000. Yeah, it would have been. And the other time I know for a fact that they performed together was live in concert. I think it was, again, during the Heather Mills period, because it was a concert. I think it might have been a Landmines related concert, or it might have been the one of those Neil Young charity concerts for the Bridge charity.
Yeah. That makes sense.
Might have been for that, where Brian and Paul sang God Only Knows together, which was very appropriate. It's actually quite touching. I haven't seen any video footage, but I've heard the audio.
Okay.
Those are the two times we know for a fact that they actually performed together. I think it would have been incredible if you've got a fully functional Brian Wilson.
Big if.
Here's the other funny thing. About 10 years ago, this was around the time, I think it might have been when, around the time that Brian put out his Gershwin album, and he was making the rounds, doing a lot of TV appearances. And I think it might have been either Conan O'Brien or maybe it was Jay Leno, who said, "What are you going to be doing next?" And Brian just announced, he goes, "I'm going to record my next album with Paul McCartney." And the audience is clapping, and whoever the host was, whether it was Conan or Jay, like, his eyes lit up and all that. And I'm sitting there going, does Paul know about this? And apparently he didn't. Apparently Brian never ran this idea by Paul, because obviously it never happened. But as recently as, maybe 10 years ago, 10, 15 years ago, it was one of Brian's ambitions to do a full album with Paul McCartney.
So he's publicly expressed what I was just kind of throwing out there as a wish, that he wanted to work with Paul. I can't imagine why Paul wouldn't want to at this point.
Well,
instrumental album.
The thing is if Paul is going to get involved with a collaboration, I love Brian Wilson. I don't want this to come off as disrespectful, but if I were Paul, my biggest concern was, well, how much of the work am I going to have to do? What kind of shape is Brian in at this point? Not only has he been through the mill, but he's 80 years old. He's an 80-year-old guy who's had a long history of mental problems and so forth and so on. It's like, if I'm going to get involved in a collaboration, how much of a real collaboration is it going to be? I mean, he collaborated on an album's worth of stuff with Elvis Costello, and it didn't come out the way it was originally planned. So I think Paul has a lot of affection and respect and love for Brian Wilson, but to get into that kind of situation on an extended basis, it would give me cause for concern.
Yeah, that's a good point. If he's looking at it that way, in terms of heavy lifting and maybe having to babysit, I don't know. Brian continues to compose and record, so it's not like he's digging him out of the scrapyard at this point.
Well, I don't know, to be honest, because the thing is that Brian's got such a backlog of unreleased material. It's like you don't know how old a lot of this stuff is, and you don't know how much help he's getting behind the scenes,
Right.
you know? And there's a reason why, for the most part, a lot of people who have worked with Brian eventually have to go their own way because it becomes such an all-consuming thing. There's a guy named Jeffrey Foskett. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he was in Brian's band for a very long time. And eventually he left, and he was handling a lot of the real high falsetto notes that Brian can't do anymore. And he was one of the musical directors, and he was really a key part of Brian's band from the Pet Sounds tour of 2000, 2001. He played a major role on the Smile tour when I saw them at Carnegie Hall and the several tours that I saw afterwards. And he ultimately left because he didn't go into details, but he said basically that he would have had to have been much more for Brian than just a musical collaborator. And you get the sense he would have had to be like babysitter, minder, you know, and all that kind of stuff. I'm not saying that they would have put Paul McCartney into that kind of situation, but it just shows that it's high maintenance.
Yeah, right. That makes total sense.
Yeah. And I don't know if Paul wants his very, fond and great feelings about Brian to be tainted in any way, you know?
Yeah. I'll remember you as you were.
Exactly. But a collaboration with the two of them in their prime, I think would have been magical.
Yeah. The same way I kind of lament that in the late 70s when George, for that brief time, when he did the self-titled album, he was looking for an outside producer. And he ended up with Russ Titleman. How that would have been an amazing thing if somebody who was not only great pop sensibility, but also great guitarist, a Lindsey Buckingham producing and working with them, what that might have churned out, those two. And he ended up with Jeff Lynne, for better or worse. But I think about other possibilities there might have been. Dave Edmunds, somebody like that.
Was it Dave Edmunds who got Paul to write On the Wings of a Nightingale for the Everly Brothers?
I think so, because he produced that record, didn't he?
Yes, that's how Paul ended up writing that song for the Everly Brothers, which I think is one of the best songs he's written since leaving the Beatles.
Here. Absolutely.
And his demo brings me to tears every time I hear it.
Absolutely. I don't think that's a song he's ever performed live on his own, is it?
Not that I know of. And believe me, I looked.
Okay. Yeah. And it was probably sacred to him. He wrote it for those guys who are responsible for a big deal of his career.
Yeah.
Not that Brian was ever averse to covers. So if Paul had ever had the notion of pitching him a song, here, Brian, we don't have to work together, but here's a song I wrote just for you.
You know what? It's funny you say that because I read, this was years ago, that when the Beach Boys put out their 1985 album, the self-titled album, just The Beach Boys, it was the first album they put out after Dennis died. And the Beach Boys management team or their people were going far and wide looking for contributors, people to contribute to the album. And at the very least, there were multiple songwriters. And whoever was involved with that album asked Paul, would you write a song for the next Beach Boys album? And from what I read, Paul's reaction was, what? No, I'm not going to write a song for the Beach Boys. Brian Wilson writes for the Beach Boys. Brian Wilson writes the Beach Boys music. I can't do that. But there was an opportunity.
Yeah, that's interesting. So it was offered, and that was his reaction to it. And he's seeing Brian, in addition to everything else, as a composer, arranger, instrumentalist. He sees him as his own songwriter, that he doesn't need a Paul McCartney to write him a song.
Right. Exactly.
Well, I guess that's valid.
Yeah. But as we were saying, because Paul has like this ongoing admiration for Brian, I remember when Paul inducted Brian into the Songwriters Hall of Fame, and the speech was very, very emotional and very touching and just continues. Paul is never at a loss for offering praise on to Brian and Pet Sounds and God Only Knows. And I probably wouldn't have even checked out Pet Sounds all those years ago if I hadn't seen Paul's quote about it. I was like, well, if Paul thinks it's great, I must check it out. And then I obviously fell in love with it myself.
So is that your gateway into the Beach Boys?
It was one of the two. The other gateway into the Beach Boys was the Endless Harmony documentary, which aired on VH1, I think it was, one weekend. And I happened to watch it. And that's where I first heard Heroes and Villains. That documentary shows footage of them performing it live. And I became obsessed with that song and just played it over and over and over again and found like every different version that was out there on bootleg and alternate takes and all that kind of stuff. Heroes and Villains just over and I drove my wife crazy from it. And those two things were my gateway. And then I was like, I went out and bought more albums and more albums and more albums. And then I started reading the books about them and doing research and all that. So that's where it began for me in the late 90s with the Beach Boys.
Okay. Yeah, I was late to the table with the Beach Boys as well, in as much as I grew up with a perception that they were just old-fashioned, antiquated. And Mike Love, honestly, I'm pretty sure I'm not alone in this, really put me off.
I didn't know enough to dislike Mike until I was well into my research and starting to really sort of like get into them in anything beyond the music.
There was just something about them. Anytime I saw the performance footage of them, he just rubbed me the wrong way. And I'm sure that says more about me than it does about him, but there's a smugness. There's something about him that trying too hard. I don't know what it was, but it just alienated me. And then when you find out and doing the research, there's plenty of good reasons why you should be alienated, and this is why. So it's like, okay, I trust my instincts. I never had a problem with the other Beach Boys. I thought Dennis was cool. There was something about him that he was sort of the outlier of that group. And then I started finding out about Brian and that he was responsible for all this stuff and had a breakdown. And I guess it was Derek Taylor that came up with the term genius for him when they first started applying it.
Yes.
And then later on, when I did see that, because it's on YouTube, the Leonard Bernstein special, it's like, wow, that really sold me on this guy, whether it constitutes genius or not. He is an incredible, sublime composer. Forget the hot rod stuff. This is amazing. And I think that was what then led me to Pet Sounds.
Yeah. I would say that the Endless Harmony documentary was really, that was a real eye opener, because up until then I had the same perception that you did. It's like, cars, girls, dumb, cheerleaders and, yeah. And it was a very well done documentary, and it showed the cool era, which was the early 70s, when they were really, letting their hair grow, figuratively and literally. And that turned me on to The Legend of Smile. And I fell down a rabbit hole for years looking for.
It's a big rabbit hole to go down when so much stuff is caught on tape and has been fed through bootleggers through the years. Come the digital age, when more Beach Boys than you ever knew you wanted to hear. It's like the Niagara reels, it's like bottomless.
Yeah. And I was chasing that stuff too, the Niagara reels and all that. So yeah, within 2 days of each other, they both turned 80. They're still kicking. That's the most amazing thing.
It is. Are you seeing Paul on his tour?
At this point, the concert tickets are so ridiculous.
Yes, they are. Okay.
I checked his dates. He's not going to be playing anywhere near me, as far as I know.
Yeah, not in Chicago either. So I've resigned myself that unless somebody sends me a gift, it's not going to happen. I've seen him 3 times at different points, starting in '89. I'm quite satiated with the live experience. It would have been nice to bring my kids to witness that history, but I also did see Brian on the Pet Sounds tour. Did I show you the picture I took?
No.
Okay. I staked out the theater. I brought Pet Sounds with me. I was determined to have him sign it. And he comes out the back door of the Rosemont Theater. We're waiting hours in the cold. Comes out there and he waves. He's wearing like a red flannel coat. He goes, "Sorry, guys, I'm tired. Next time." So that's the picture I have of him.
Oh, my God. I've seen Paul about 5 times since '89. I've seen Brian about 4 or 5 times. And like I said, I saw him at the Smile tour at Carnegie Hall opening night, which was an amazing experience. And then I saw him do it again. And then I saw the Pet Sounds tour of 2006, I think it was, which was incredible. He was so on that night. I was lucky. I caught him on a good night. And he was amazing. He was funny and he was emotional and his voice sounded great. And he did God Only Knows. And again, this was as part of Pet Sounds. That was the context. He's doing the whole album. And he said, Paul McCartney called this the greatest song I ever written. And God Only Knows. He was so beautiful the way he did it. We literally gave him a 10-minute standing ovation for that song alone. And he kept trying to move the show along. He kept trying to stop us, and we wouldn't stop. We were clapping louder and louder. And so we finally settled down and he was able to move on to the next song. And about 2 or 3 songs later, and Brian Wilson, he doesn't remember what he ate like 5 minutes ago, you know? I mean, that's how unique he is, okay? He just has no memory or anything. 2 or 3 songs later, he stopped the show and he said, I just want to thank you for the response you gave to God Only Knows. You don't know how much that means to me. And I was like, wow, this is an incredible moment. This is really, I mean, first of all, that he remembered, you know, and second, that he stopped the show to just ad lib, you know, and just like say something off the cuff. It was a magical night for me. It was just fantastic. So I saw him a couple of times more since then. Paul, I think the last time I saw him was when they opened Citi Field, which used to be Shea Stadium. And he opened that, and I got to see him play that show. I think that was the last time I saw him.
I don't think until those two share a stage, you're ever going to top that Brian story as a live experience. That must have been incredible. A transcendental, moving moment in a concert. I've had a few, but that's pretty up there.
The closest I ever got to that with a Paul concert is when this was in 2002. Is the last concert my wife and I went to before she gave birth to our daughter. So she was like already starting to show and everything. And Paul performed Mother Nature's Son.
Oh, cool.
And my wife looked over. She says, why are you crying? And I said, because I never thought I'd ever get to see him play this live. So that was like a really emotional experience for me because I love that song. And it's a song that I used to sing to my daughter to put her to sleep.
How cool. It seems a common thing among Beatle people like us that we have certain songs that might not be obvious or real mainstream that we associate with our children, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
And I have 2 children, a son and a daughter. My son was born the year as your daughter, 2002. My daughter was born 2006, and I choreographed what I wanted the first music to be when they were born. And with my son, it was Here Comes the Sun. I had it ready, I guess in 2002, maybe it was a boombox or something. I can't remember how I did it. So that played as he entered the material world. And for my daughter, it was I'd Have You Anytime.
Oh, wow.
Let me in here. I know
that's terrific.
Here. Yeah. And that was me coming up with an idea of how I wanted my kids to enter the world with something soothing. Both happen to be George songs for whatever reason.
Right. Yeah.
But now I can't escape forever. 10 million times I hear Here Comes the Sun. That's what I think about.
Right. Well, with my daughter, I waited a little bit longer than you did. But I would like be sitting in the glider with her, like rocking her. I'd sing her Mother Nature's Son, and I'd sing You Still Believe in Me.
What's that? Is that Beach Boys?
Yeah, from Pet Sounds.
Oh,
it's the second song of a Pet Sounds.
I was thinking, for some reason I think of Billy Joel. I don't know why.
And I would sing her Darlin' by the Beach Boys.
Oh, wow.
And I would sing Blackbird, you know, all the really sort of, you know, all the Paul and Brian stuff, basically.
Yeah, that's the pattern. Rocking my son, I do remember singing Getting in Tune to him.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Baby with you, baby with you.
And the funny thing is with my daughter, when she was in, I guess, pre-nursery, when she was a baby, I mean, a little baby, and they would teach them sign language. And so she couldn't have been more than a year old. And they would teach her like the thing for more.
Yes.
So if
we
like,
taught
you know,
our kids that too.
yeah, more. And so I would sing her You Still Believe in Me from Pet Sounds, and she would go more.
Wow.
Yeah.
Cool. So
Yeah.
is she still a Beach Boys fan?
Yeah. In fact, at her bat mitzvah, we danced to God Only Knows, actually. The father-daughter dance was God Only Knows.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
How cool. Man, I wonder if Brian gets many of those stories.
Well, he used to participate in his website. There used to be a chat function. And when they first started it, every now and then he and his wife would like
chime in.
And so there was one night where I actually got to like send them a message that, you know, I sing Darlin' and You Still Believe in Me to my daughter and she loves it. And his wife actually wrote back to me and said, you know, she sent me like a heart, you know,
nice.
which was,
That's something.
which was, yeah, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's pretty amazing.
It?
No, I didn't know how to do it back then. I wasn't computer savvy enough back then to do that.
That's funny.
The 60s, particularly, he wrote some music that when I played it, it made me cry. And I don't quite know why. It wasn't necessarily the words or the music. There's just something so deep in it that there's only certain pieces of music can do this to me. And just reaches right down in me. And I think it's a sign of great genius to be able to do that with a bunch of words and a bunch of notes. And this man, he deserves to be in the Hall of Fame, that's for sure. So thank you, sir, for everything you've done for me, for making me cry, for having that thing you can do with your music. You just put those notes, those harmonies together, stick a couple of words over the top of it, and you've got me any day. Ladies and gentlemen, Brian Wilson.
Something About the Beatles. Created and hosted by Robert Rodriguez. Executive producer Rick Way. Title song by the Corgis.